June 6, 1944, the shores of Normandy erupted in chaos. A Sherman tank known as Fury took a direct enemy shell and was left crippled. Its crew bailed out, believing the mission was finished, but one man refused to quit. Sergeant Curtis Cullen, no engineer, no formal training, just a mechanic from New Jersey, had a wild concept involving leftover metal and a welding torch. His commander called it madness. Yet within 2 days he created something so clever that General Eisenhower himself would later order thousands to be built. This isn't a story from any textbook. It's the forgotten tale of how a sergeant with a torch helped change the outcome of D-Day. 6 days after the invasion began, Allied forces found themselves paralyzed, not by tanks or artillery, but by Normandy's ancient hedgerows. These weren't garden hedges. They were centuries-old earthen walls reinforced with stones and thick roots, towering up to 15 feet high. They formed a maze across the countryside, perfect for German ambushes. Every time an American tank tried to climb one, its underside, the weakest armor, was exposed. Hidden German gunners waited for that moment. One hit, one burning Sherman. Cullen watched this nightmare unfold day after day. Tanks turned into fireballs, crews rarely escaped, medics couldn't keep up. The advance that should have reached miles inland was now crawling only yards a day. The enemy didn't need reinforcements. The terrain itself had become their fortress. Cullen wasn't an engineer, but he understood machines. He saw leverage where others saw obstacles. One afternoon, as another Sherman died trying to scale a hedge, he realized the problem. Tanks shouldn't go over the hedgerows. They needed to go through them. If a tank could cut through the base, it would keep its armor low and frontal, staying protected from German fire. The challenge was figuring out how to punch through 10 feet of earth and roots hardened by centuries. As ideas formed, Cullen began sketching designs in his notebook. His crew teased him. "Cullen's going to win the war with doodles." They had no idea how right they were. The jokes came with a smirk, but there was skepticism underneath. Many had tried solving the hedgerow problem before. None had succeeded. What made one sergeant think he could? But Cullen had long learned that mechanics were often underestimated. People assumed fixing engines meant a lack of intellect, but true mechanics were innovators. Every repair was a riddle in metal and motion, and this time Normandy itself was the broken machine that needed fixing. Cullen's solution was bold. He proposed using scrap from destroyed German defences to build steel teeth for the Sherman. When attached to the front, they would slice through the hedgerow instead of climbing it. He pitched the idea to Captain Samuel Morrison. "So let me get this straight," Morrison said, incredulous. "You want to weld scrap metal onto a damaged tank, then drive it full speed into a wall of dirt and roots?" Cullen nodded. "Yes, sir. The current method gets us killed. My plan keeps the armor facing the enemy. They can't shoot what they can't hit." The logic was sound and insane. A single mistake could destroy the tank and crew, but if it worked, it could open a path for the entire army. Morrison hesitated, then finally said, "You've got 48 hours. Build your prototype. If it fails, we'll both be explaining this to some furious generals." Cullen saluted and immediately began scavenging the beaches, littered with the remains of German Czech hedgehogs, massive steel anti-tank obstacles shaped like giant jacks. They were perfect raw material. Working by torchlight, Cullen and his small crew sliced apart the beams, sharpening and reinforcing them into 4 sturdy blades, each nearly 4 feet long and heavy as iron rails. By the end of the first night, the framework of the invention was ready. The next challenge, attaching it to the Sherman without compromising its armor or movement. What began as a crazy sketch was turning into something real, a weapon that might just change the war. Cullen measured and welded with absolute precision. The prongs had to hit low enough to bite the earth, wide enough to tear a path, and strong enough to endure the violent impact of 30 tons of steel. Private Eddie Kowalski, one of the welders, stared at the creation skeptically. "You sure this isn't going to blow up in our faces?" Cullen, lifting his welding mask, smirked. "Physics doesn't lie. Either the hedge gives way or it's about to meet its match." By dawn, the transformation was complete. The Sherman now looked like a monster, 4 sharpened steel tusks jutting from its nose. Soldiers crowded around to stare, some amused, others convinced Cullen was about to get court-martialed. One joked, "Looks like a pig trying to fight a porcupine." Cullen patted the steel and replied, "Maybe so, but this pig's going to chew its way to Berlin." Captain Morrison inspected the welds carefully, nodded and said, "All right, Sergeant. Tomorrow morning, we test it. Let's see if this is brilliance or suicide." That night, Cullen barely slept. Every calculation replayed in his mind. The angles, the strength, the risk. If he was wrong, men could die. But if he was right, he'd save hundreds. At sunrise, the modified Sherman rumbled toward a massive hedgerow chosen for the test. Officers gathered to watch, silent and tense. The volunteer crew closed their hatches and revved the engine. Morrison raised his hand, then dropped it. The tank roared forward. 30 tons of armored fury slammed into the earth with a deafening crack. Soil burst outward, roots snapped like gunfire, and for the first time since D-Day, a Sherman tank broke through a hedgerow. The invention worked. The Cullen cutter was born, and from that moment, the Allied advance across Normandy would never again be stopped by walls of earth. For a few seconds, no one breathed. Then, the impossible happened. The Sherman began crawling forward. The prongs bit deep into the old hedgerow, tearing through centuries of packed dirt, roots and stone. Instead of tilting upward, the tank's nose stayed low, keeping its front armor toward any threat that might lurk ahead. The engine roared, the ground split, and in one final burst of power, the Sherman exploded through the far side of the hedge. It left behind a perfect gap, wide enough for more vehicles to pass, and clean enough that the tank's vulnerable belly was never once exposed. Cheers erupted from the soldiers watching. Cullen almost collapsed with relief. His insane idea. It had worked. Mitchell, the driver, popped his hatch and shouted, "Smoothest hedge crossing I've ever had. Didn't even feel the bump." Major Williams walked up, his face unreadable. "Sergeant," he said slowly, "how many tanks can you modify, and how fast?" Cullen answered, "If I get a proper welding crew and enough of those beach obstacles, we can do 10 a day, maybe more." Williams shook his head. "Not enough." Cullen's heart sank until the Major smiled. "You're getting 50 welders. I want 100 tanks done by week's end. I'm sending this straight to General Bradley." Captain Morrison slapped Cullen on the shoulder. "Congratulations, Sergeant. You're officially the man who saved Normandy." But Cullen wasn't celebrating. "Sir, one field test doesn't prove it'll work in combat. We need to try it under fire." Morrison nodded. "I was expecting you to say that. There's a German stronghold 2 miles from here. We've been losing men for 3 days trying to reach it. You'll ride along tomorrow with Mitchell's crew. If this invention works there, it'll be the proof everyone needs." Cullen swallowed hard. He had hoped to stay behind and build. Instead, he'd be riding straight into hell to see if his machine really deserved the praise. That night, Cullen inspected every inch of the modified Sherman. He checked the welds, tightened bolts, and ran his hands along the steel prongs for cracks. Everything looked perfect, but battle never cared about perfect. Private Chen found him still working under the dim light of a lantern. "You should sleep, Sarge," he said. "Big day tomorrow." "Can't," Cullen replied. "Too much to think about." "Scared?" "Terrified," Cullen admitted. "We've tested it once, but tomorrow real men live or die on my math." Chen smiled faintly. "Then I'm glad it's your math. You built this thing. You'll get us through." Dawn came with a misty drizzle. The modified Sherman, now proudly nicknamed Rhinoceros, rumbled to life. Cullen took position in the commander's hatch, nerves coiled tight. Their mission: punch through the German defences that had stopped every advance so far. "Mount up," came the order. Engines across the field roared awake. The Rhinoceros rolled forward, its steel blades glinting in the wet light. Ahead lay a deadly hedgerow, hiding a machine gun nest that had shredded American troops for days. Cullen's voice crackled through the intercom. "Angle it 20 degrees. Let the blades bite in." "Roger that," Mitchell replied. The impact was brutal. The tank slammed into the hedge, dirt and roots flying. Inside, the crew braced as the hull shook violently, but the prongs held. The Sherman pushed through, broke the barrier, and came face to face with stunned German gunners. One shot from the main cannon ended them before they could react. "It works," Chen shouted. "It actually works in combat." But there was no time to celebrate. More hedgerows waited. The Rhinoceros kept moving, tearing through obstacle after obstacle. Behind it, infantry surged forward through the breaches. For the first time since D-Day, the Americans were advancing freely through Normandy's cursed maze. The next hedge hid something far worse: a German Panther. The enemy's 75mm gun could tear a Sherman apart before it got close. If the Rhinoceros got stuck, they were finished. "Contact front," Harrison yelled. "Panther behind the hedge." Cullen thought fast. They could retreat, call in artillery, or gamble everything. "No retreat," he ordered. "We breach now. Speed and surprise. That's our edge." Mitchell didn't hesitate. The tank thundered forward. The hedge was thicker than any before. The Rhinoceros shuddered, slowing under the strain. "More power," Cullen shouted. The engine screamed, smoke pouring from the exhaust, but inch by inch they forced their way through. The tank burst out of the hedge at an angle, just as the Panther swung its turret. Harrison already had the gun sighted. He fired. The shell punched through the Panther's thinner side armour. A second later, smoke billowed from the enemy tank. Its crew fled, throwing up their hands. When American infantry caught up, the officer in charge grinned up at the battered Rhinoceros. "Sergeant Cullen, I don't know what magic that is, but you just broke the line we've been stuck at for 3 days." Cullen climbed out, trembling with adrenaline. His design had survived real battle, even against Germany's best. Captain Morrison arrived moments later, radio in hand. "Division's on the line. General Bradley wants to see you. They're calling your design the Cullen Cutter, and they've just ordered 5,000 of them." Cullen blinked. 5,000? Morrison nodded. "You're the man who solved the hedgerow problem. Time to own it." Within days, orders spread through Normandy. Every tank would be fitted with Cullen's hedgerow cutter. Welding crews worked around the clock. Engineers scavenged more steel from the beaches, transforming piles of twisted German obstacles into salvation for Allied armour. Cullen himself was reassigned to oversee the conversions. He went from camp to camp, showing soldiers the proper angles for welding the prongs. "Low enough to dig," he'd say, marking the line with chalk, "but not so low you just shove dirt. 15 degrees, that's your sweet spot." At first, some welders doubted him. The design looked crude, improvised. But once they saw footage of Rhinoceros tanks tearing through hedgerows that had once stopped entire divisions, their skepticism vanished. The men worked faster, proud to be part of something that was changing the war. General Omar Bradley himself visited one of the field workshops. He found Cullen knee-deep in sparks, teaching a new crew. "Sergeant Cullen, I presume," Cullen snapped to attention. "Yes, sir." "At ease," Bradley said with a smile. "You've done what engineers and generals couldn't. You got my army moving again." He clapped Cullen on the shoulder. "You're being recommended for the Legion of Merit and a promotion to technical sergeant. We need more men who think like you." After Bradley left, Cullen's comrades celebrated wildly, but he felt uneasy. The recognition felt hollow. "If only I'd thought of it sooner," he murmured to Kowalski. "How many crews might still be alive?" Kowalski shook his head. "You can't save the ones we lost, but you're saving everyone else. Every tank that rolls today owes you its life." Cullen nodded quietly. He knew his friend was right. His invention wasn't just metal and welding. It was the difference between life and death, and the reason Allied tanks would never again be trapped by Normandy's walls. In the quiet moments, Cullen's thoughts drifted to the tank crews who had died during those first brutal weeks in Normandy. If only he'd thought of it sooner. If only he'd pushed harder. But war didn't allow if-onlys. You moved forward, or you were crushed by regret. As the Cullen cutter spread across the front, soldiers began sending in their own field improvements. The invention worked beautifully, but like any good tool, it evolved. Some crews added a fifth central prong for thicker hedgerows. Others experimented with serrated tips that shredded roots more efficiently. A few welded extra plates to shield the mounts from enemy fire. Cullen loved every bit of it. "I never said it was perfect," he told a war correspondent. "I just said it worked. The real genius is in the field, the guys who make it better." One clever idea came from the 3rd Armoured Division. They added a rotating mechanism that automatically cleared mud and roots from the prongs. Simple, effective, and brilliant. Cullen quickly made it part of the official design. "See that?" he told his welding teams. "That's real engineering. Problems solved by the people who actually use the tool." The Germans at first were baffled. Reports captured after the war showed confusion. Allied armour was suddenly bursting through hedgerows that had once been perfect defences. When they finally understood, they tried countermeasures. Mines, angled ambushes, fake hedgerows rigged with guns. None worked. The core problem remained. The Sherman's thick frontal armour now faced them at all times. By August 1944, as Allied forces pushed past Normandy and began their sweep across France, the cutter had become standard issue. New tanks rolling off US production lines came with factory-welded attachment points. A battlefield hack had become official design. As combat moved beyond the hedgerow country, soldiers found new uses. The cutters smashed through brick walls and barricades in cities, helping clear sniper nests. In river crossings, the prongs acted like claws, gripping muddy banks. In snow, they worked as makeshift ploughs, carving paths through drifts. Cullen, now a master sergeant, travelled from unit to unit, documenting these innovations and training crews. His creation had become more than a weapon. It was a tool of adaptation, reshaping how Allied armour fought. Cullen filled notebooks with sketches and field notes, refining designs as he went. "I never imagined they'd use them like this," he wrote home. "I built them for bushes, and they're using them to move tanks." The Battle of the Bulge proved it again. When the Germans blocked roads with felled trees, Sherman crews used their cutters to bulldoze straight through. One report even described a Sherman using the prongs to shove a disabled German tank off a narrow road, clearing the way for an entire column. "I designed a hedge cutter," Cullen laughed. "Now it's a bulldozer." Still, not every story was positive. Some tanks damaged their cutters trying to plough through reinforced concrete. Others snapped welds under too much strain. There were even tragic friendly fire incidents when other units mistook the pronged silhouette for a new German weapon in fog or smoke. Cullen took these failures personally. He worked with engineers to create proper manuals. "It's a tool, Not a miracle, he told trainees. Use it wrong, and it'll get you killed. Use it right, and it'll save you. By early 1945, the hedgerow cutter was as much a part of the Sherman as its gun. New recruits didn't even know there had been a time before it. Captain Morrison once told him, "You know something works when people forget it was ever a problem." Cullen smiled and winced. He couldn't help but think about the unintended consequences. The cutters made tanks unstoppable, and that emboldened commanders. Assaults that once would have been delayed were now ordered immediately. It saved time, but it also cost lives. Cullen admitted to Chaplain O'Brien, "Maybe I made them too confident." The chaplain shook his head. "You gave them a tool that saved lives. What they chose to do with it, that's on them." Still, Cullen wrestled with the thought. His invention had made killing easier, even if it also made survival possible. "I didn't kill anyone myself," Cullen told Kowalski one night, "but my invention made it easier for others to do it. And now they're pinning medals on me for that." Kowalski's answer was firm. "You stopped men from dying in burning tanks, Sarge. You shortened the war. That's what matters. Every day it ended sooner, people on both sides lived who otherwise wouldn't." Cullen nodded, but the guilt never really left. The rapid Allied advance brought its own new problems. Supply lines strained under the pace. Fuel and ammo couldn't keep up with the speed the cutters allowed tanks to move. Cullen found himself sitting in strategy meetings with logistics officers, explaining that his success had created chaos. "You wanted faster tanks," he said. "Now figure out how to feed them." Strangely, he'd become a kind of celebrity. Soldiers lined up for autographs. War correspondents begged for interviews. Cullen hated it. "I'm no hero," he told Morrison. "I just welded scrap metal to a tank." Morrison shook his head. "You're a different kind of hero, Curtis. You used your brain instead of a rifle. That's what wins wars." Cullen learned to live with the fame, though he never truly liked it. In his mind, he was still the mechanic from New Jersey who figured out how to drive through a hedge. Germany surrendered on May 8, 1945. The war in Europe was over. Cullen stood in a ruined German village as the celebrations began. Around him, soldiers cheered, hugged, and drank whatever they could find. The war was finally done. The Cullen cutter had done its part. Analysts later estimated it shortened the Normandy campaign by weeks, maybe months, speeding up the liberation of France and the fall of Berlin. Eisenhower himself called it one of the war's most important tactical innovations. Cullen received the Legion of Merit, the Bronze Star, and a promotion to warrant officer. He was in the papers now, the garage mechanic who outsmarted the Reich. But as he stood watching the sunset over the shattered town, he felt strangely hollow. His invention had mattered in war, but now that the war was over, it was just scrap metal again. Kowalski appeared beside him with 2 bottles of beer. "You looked like a man thinking too hard." "Just wondering what it all meant," Cullen said. "It meant you saved lives, mine included. If tanks couldn't breach those hedges, I'd be dead." They drank in silence for a while. "You know what I keep thinking," Cullen said. "Those German tankers, hiding behind their hedgerows, thinking they were safe, until suddenly we're bursting through. What must that have felt like?" "Like losing," Kowalski said simply. Cullen nodded. In a way, his invention had changed more than tactics. It had changed the rules. And that was the nature of war. Every innovation rewrote the battlefield, rendering someone's defense obsolete. Progress, he thought, was just war's quieter twin. "What do you do with thousands of tanks when there are no more hedges to cut?" Cullen asked one day. Kowalski chuckled. "Scrap them, or keep them as souvenirs. Either way, they did their job." Cullen returned home to New Jersey in late 1945. He went back to fixing cars, the same work he'd done before the war. The medals stayed in a drawer. He rarely talked about the Cullen cutter. When neighbours asked what he did in the army, he'd shrug. Just fixed tanks. His wife Margaret once pressed him. You changed history. Why won't you talk about it? I'm proud of what it did, he said quietly, but not of what it was for. I made something to help kill people. I'd rather fix things now. Decades passed. Military historians began writing about his invention. It appeared in books, documentaries, and museum exhibits. Yet Cullen himself remained a quiet footnote. In 1984, a young historian named David Carter tracked him down. Mr. Cullen, he said, do you realize how significant your invention was? You shortened the Normandy campaign. You saved thousands. Cullen smiled faintly. I wasn't special. I just saw a problem and had the chance to fix it. The miracle wasn't me. It was that the army let a sergeant with no degree try something new. The lesson is simple. Good ideas can come from anywhere. Curtis Cullen passed away in 1963. His obituary called him a mechanic and veteran. It never mentioned that his idea helped win a war, but in museums across the world, old Sherman tanks still stand with jagged steel prongs welded to their fronts. Crude, simple, and revolutionary. Beside them, a small plaque bears his name. Sergeant Curtis Cullen, the mechanic who refused to believe a problem couldn't be solved